Welcome, everyone, to the second day of this year's German-American Conference at Harvard. My name is Daniel Diaz, and I'm one of the organizers of this year's conference. And we're extremely excited to kick off the second day of the conference with a discussion on the current events in Afghanistan. This session is going to be titled Afghanistan, Friendship or Just Strategic Interests? And we are extremely excited to welcome our moderator, Dr. Steven Sokol, the president of the American Council on Germany, to this event. Welcome.
Thank you. Delighted to be here.
My name is Karim Pouhadieh, and together with Daniel, I would like to introduce our panelists. Please welcome with me Ambassador Markus Potzel, who is the current German ambassador to Afghanistan. He was the German special envoy for Afghanistan and Pakistan from September 2017 until 2021. In this capacity, he coordinated Germany's diplomatic engagement with this region and consulted with international partners on options for further civilization. Also, many thanks for coming to Professor Nathalie Tocci, the director of the Istituto Affari Internazionali, and the current Pierre Keller visiting professor at the Harvard Kennedy School. She wrote the global strategy and a European global strategy and worked on its implementation.
We would also like to offer a welcome to Professor Erik Jensen, which I think has just joined our call. He is a professor of practice of law and director of the Rule of Law program at Stanford Law. And he's also the director of the Afghanistan Legal Education Project. And last but not least, a warm welcome also to Summia Tora, the first road scholar from Afghanistan and the founder of the Dosti network, a network that was born out of Summia's effort in trying to evacuate her own family out of Afghanistan, and which is now a global effort to connect Afghans fleeing persecution with resources to resettle in a safe country, and for those staying in Afghanistan to access needed resources. Summia will start with her opening remarks on her personal experiences in this current situation. Thank you so much for sharing your story, Summia. The stage is yours.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today to listen to this very important panel conversation about Afghanistan. My name is Summia, and I'm the founder of Dosti Network. Dosti is a network of people around the globe working to connect Afghan families fleeing persecution with resources to reach safety. We believe every Afghan has a right to access resources for physical, social, and economic security. Therefore, this network has the mission to empower Afghan families to navigate information and resources to resettle in another country or find safety within Afghanistan. So why did I decide to build Dosti Network? Dosti Network was really born out of my own personal experience of trying to evacuate my father. So let me take you back beginning of August, 2 weeks before the Afghan state collapsed. And at that time, I was completing my master's degree in public policy at the University of Oxford. I was following the news very closely every day and monitoring how the Taliban was very quickly taking over different provinces. And day by day, they were getting very close to Kabul. At that time, my father and my uncle were the only two immediate family members living in Kabul. Meanwhile, the rest of my family were living as refugees in Pakistan. At the beginning of August, after doing extensive research, I realized that the Taliban could take over not within few months, but maybe potentially in few weeks. So I decided that I had very limited time and I started working on trying to get my father out of Afghanistan. So I began with the usual immigration process where I was looking for routes for him to be resettled along with my family who were now in Pakistan to get resettled in the United States. So I started collecting different paper documentations and look for any avenue that was possible for link with the US because my father had previously worked with USAID and I was trying to see if I could apply for an immigrant visa. I spent first 2 weeks of August trying to collect various documents, but then soon realized it might take me years to put the immigration documents required by the US government to get my father to the US. So I quickly gave up on that route and started looking for any possible avenue to get a visa for my father to get out. On August 12th, I started a fundraising campaign, which put out my plea for help around the world. And I shared my story of trying to get my father out. And quickly, within 2 days, I raised over $20,000 to purchase flights for my father to get out of the country. But on August 15, I woke up to the news that the Afghan government had fled the country and the Taliban had taken over. So I was devastated, and I started looking at the news and looked at the state of the airport and the panic that everybody had in their eyes, families running to catch any flight possible. And the airport was in a chaos. And everybody was in fear of what life would be like living under the Taliban regime, including my father and my uncle. From then on, I began the mission to evacuate my father. And very quickly, several Oxford students and people from all around the world who were following my story through the GoFundMe link started quickly mobilize and help me find any way possible to get my father on an evacuation flight. For 15 days, we wrote appeals, emails, called anyone around the world who could help get my father out of Kabul. I soon realized that my father did not meet the criteria of various government-run evacuation flights. He was not a special immigrant visa. He did not have a special immigrant visa. He had not worked closely with the US military, nor he was a high-profile government official, nor was he affiliated to any of the European countries' governments. So he was not necessarily a priority for a lot of the evacuations that were being run. What really put my father at risk was the reality that he was my father and the work that I had been doing in Afghanistan over the years, trying to educate girls about menstrual hygiene and the advocacy work I did for refugees abroad. In those 15 days, I barely slept, ate, or did anything besides work from every single angle to help my father get out, because I knew that I was truly responsible for putting my father at risk. After 15 days of everyone around me rallying and advocating on my family's behalf, my father and uncle were actually both evacuated from Kabul safely. And this evacuation was done with the support of Schmidt Futures and Yelda Hakim Foundation. After my father was evacuated, I thought I would finally feel relieved and very happy. But at the end of the 15-day mark, I realized that there were so many other Afghan families who had reached out to ask me for help that I had began helping. And the reality was that most of these families were stuck and left behind. So my father was truly one of the few people who were lucky enough to make it out of Afghanistan. Some of these Afghans who I'm currently still working with and trying to help them reach safety include interpreters who have worked with the US military, they've worked with NATO, some have worked in Afghan National Defense Forces, and many are also at risk of being persecuted due to their ethnicity and their religious belief. And most of them are still stuck and have no way to get out. What I realized was that not many of these people were lucky to have access to resources like my father. Many of these families did not have access to information or connections that could help them understand pathways to reach safety. Many families did not have groups like I did who could advocate on their behalf. And most importantly, many of them did not have passports or proper documentations, which to this day creates a very big challenge for many Afghans to be able to leave the country. Since evacuating my father, I, along with Dosti team, have continued working to find safe ways to help these families reach safety and help them access resources within Afghanistan. We're currently working with over 100 Afghan families, and the number is growing every day. The number keeps growing not only due to the fact that most of these families are at risk of being persecuted, but it is also due to the ongoing crisis in Afghanistan. For many Afghan families who are fleeing, they're now trying to flee not because they might get persecuted, but because they do not have access to basic resources such as income, education, food, and safe shelter. Since the Taliban took over on August 15th, most developed nations in the West have frozen their direct aid to Afghanistan. The country is facing major issues such as ban on girls' education, drought, food insecurity, and a deteriorating economy. According to UNICEF, at least 1 million children in Afghanistan will suffer from severe acute malnutrition this year. UNHCR recently warned that by the end of 2021, the humanitarian crisis could displace 500,000 more Afghans, and it has called on many countries to keep their borders open to provide support to Afghan refugees. I emphasize all these factors because as I'm working with several families in Dosti network, I have come to realize that most of these families will eventually not want to leave Afghanistan because of the dangers they face from the Taliban, but because Afghanistan will no longer be a place where they could live lives in any basic form or have the necessities or the basic requirements to be able to live a life that's sustainable. And many will choose to flee. And this will actually create another cycle of crisis where many will be trying to flee and will try to find any way possible, whether that's smuggling, human trafficking, to get out. And it is therefore very important that we talk about these issues and find ways of addressing these current challenges that we're facing within the country to prevent another cycle of trying to evacuate many Afghans from Afghanistan. So I'm looking forward to hearing from other panelists, their views on this, and learning more about how we together as an international community can support Afghans. Thank you.
Summia, thank you so much. Thank you for making your experience and your family's experience and that of so many Afghans much more tangible to our viewers. But thank you also for the truly inspirational and important work that you're doing through the Dosti network. I think, for people to hear about that, it's incredibly important. And as you outlined at the end of your remarks just now, there are a whole slew of challenges that are facing Afghanistan, but also the international community as a whole. And so I think what I'd like to do over the next hour or so is put sort of some of your comments into a broader context of where things stand and how important your personal experience is in all of this, but for us to take a step back and look at the bigger picture. In a sense, our conversation today could not be more timely. There was no question that this was an important topic and one that should be addressed by a group like the one that we have assembled here today. But the fact that earlier this week, Taliban representatives attended their first international conference since they took power in Afghanistan in August by gathering in Moscow with senior officials from Russia and China and other countries makes our conversation today, I think, all the more important. I think all of us who have watched Afghanistan and have watched the developments there have known that the US withdrawal was a long time in coming. And yet it seemed as if political leaders in the United States, in Europe, underestimated how strong the Taliban was and how quickly it would fill the vacuum that was left by the withdrawal. And now, as Summia has described, we're seeing a serious humanitarian crisis unfolding in Afghanistan. And I think many on the outside are standing and saying it is our moral responsibility and our obligation, but also critical for regional stability to provide aid to Afghanistan. And so, Erik, I'd like to start with you. You, of course, have been involved with developments in Afghanistan for over 20 years. You lived in the subcontinent for 10 years, 6 of which you spent in Pakistan. From your vantage point, as you watch the crisis unfolding in Afghanistan, what actions can be taken to stop or slow, at least slow, the humanitarian crisis there?
Thank you, Steve. I think the humanitarian crisis requires a multi-pronged approach because it is so fragile. On one level, the efforts, as Summia put so well, efforts to get people out of the country continue on. And I'm focused on, I sit on the board of American University of Afghanistan and have developed a law program there over the last 12 years. We're working on getting people out of the country, and our students are spread across 14 countries. But we continue to teach online. Still, those efforts need to continue. Lawyers tend to attract paperwork, and I am working with a group of my former students, Stanford law students, to fill out the paperwork for American University of Afghanistan, students, faculty, staff, and their families. This is a population of about 3,000 people. We are, the US immigration system needs fixing, and that's a terrible understatement. There is a window that's called a P1, P2 window to get Afghans from third countries to the US. So far, that has seemed utterly feckless. So we are pursuing humanitarian parole, filing the paperwork for humanitarian parole for our target population. Now, it's ultimately a political decision, but we want the documentation in place in the hopes that the political side will improve and that the legal regime will improve as well. But the humanitarian crisis that Summia outlines is very real. I mean, she had very good data points. I'd add, poverty levels could be at 85 to 90% within 6 months. And with that, we're talking about starvation. We're talking about real serious deprivation and loss of life. The tricky thing in providing humanitarian assistance to Afghanistan is that it needs to go in a separate track from the international recognition that one would that the Taliban have been seeking in Moscow this week. The international recognition would then free up all sorts of funding for the regime. It seems to me that that funding should be available only upon certain conditions. And those conditions would include issues of human rights, certainly women's rights. If we don't make this a condition of assistance, I fear that we will be going back to the future with the Taliban regime. So the Taliban want international recognition. They've got funds, $6 billion frozen in the US. They need that funding. They need development assistance. The tricky thing about humanitarian assistance is until international recognition, that humanitarian assistance needs to be very specifically targeted to humanitarian assistance and not other causes that the Taliban might want to support.
Erik, thank you for that. And thank you also for sort of weaving together these two themes, right? The one of international recognition and how the rest of the world responds to the situation in Afghanistan, but also this real question that Summia also talked about how we go about getting people out of Afghanistan. And so I'd like to now turn to Ambassador Markus Potzel, who has many years of experience with Afghanistan, but also with the Taliban, and maybe ask you sort of two questions. The first one is, what is Germany actively doing to try to help rescue people in Afghanistan, to try to get them out of the country? But then more broadly, what's your assessment of how the Taliban was in such a strong position to begin with and able to fill the vacuum that was left behind?
Thank you, Steve. I start with your latter question on what made the Taliban that strong that they could overwhelm and overrun the country in such a quick pace. We were all taken by surprise, I have to say, by that speed. And when you said that we probably underestimated the Taliban, I would rather say we overestimated the Republic. We overestimated the capabilities and the willingness of the ANDSF, of the police and soldiers. They were obviously not willing anymore to fight for an elite that they consider to be corrupt, and that they were corrupt, of course, and to support warlords that we actually turned blind eye on for many years on their behavior, on their corruption. So that's also our mistake we made, actually. I mean, Taliban, they were in a position they needed to win. We had to win as the West. For them, it was enough not to lose, and it was a sort of guerrilla and rooted in the population, no doubt about that. Without certain rooting in the population, you can't be successful as a guerrilla movement. And the question is why? Yeah, as I said, I mean, I think that the most striking reason why Taliban were so successful was that the republic was, in contrast to the Taliban, was not rooted in the population. And we, I was ambassador in Kabul before, between 2014 and 2016. We were moving in a bubble of urban elite population. We didn't get in contact with rural population in Helmand and in Paktika, for instance. Your second question, Steve, on what is Germany doing at the moment? We feel responsible. We have more or less 3 categories of people who want to help get out of Afghanistan. It's German citizens who are still there, 200 to 300. At the beginning of the crisis, 15th of August, there were 80 on the list, but the list grew by the day. These were mainly Germans of Afghan origin who went to Afghanistan still at the beginning of August to have to spend their holidays there, to celebrate wedding parties and so on and so forth. And they have a legal, I mean, they have a right by law that we help them out of a crisis situation. Number 2, it's local staff who used to work for us, and we feel a strong responsibility for them as well. And number 3, Afghans who were exposed in the society as, let's say, human rights activists, lawyers, journalists, especially female activists. But we also try, I mean, it's very subjective feeling how endangered you are. I mean, we have a number of local staff whom we made the offer or put the choice, we can help bring you out, or we pay you an annual salary for GIZ, for instance, our implementing organization, and you stay in the country. And many of those took the option to stay in the country and have a sort of perspective. And that's what also Summia said, that people in Afghanistan need to have a perspective to stay there. And that's what we actually, in my talks also with the Taliban, would make clear to them. It's up to them now. They have a bad track record, but it's now up to them to make things better, to show the Afghan people and the world that they have changed. There are certain positive signals, not enough, of course. And as Erik said, development cooperation will only be resumed when certain criteria are being met. But humanitarian aid is being paid regardless of any conditions. So that goes directly to the Afghan people, not via Taliban, but via UN organizations and other organizations. I stop here.
So I think you've touched on a very important point, and this is a thread that has run through what Summia and Erik said as well, of what are the prospects for the future. And I think that takes on a particular importance when thinking about this week's meetings, because the Taliban representatives were put under some pressure to form a more inclusive government, to pursue more friendly policies towards neighboring countries. And so I'd now like to bring Nathalie Tocci into the conversation, because Nathalie, you've actually written fairly recently about the European response to the US withdrawal in Afghanistan and the lack of coordination in that process. But more broadly, I'd be interested in hearing from you what lessons you draw from the last 20 years of engagement in Afghanistan, the way that the withdrawal was handled, and now this resurgence of the Taliban.
Well, thank you, Stephen, and really great listening to all of you, really beginning with Summia, that I was really, I guess like all of us, very much touched by her remarks. I think the way in which I look at it is really seeing the way in which Afghanistan has, and sort of US and the Western role in Afghanistan, the way in which, in a sense, over the last 20 years, this has really tracked and reflected much broader, I would say, 3 main stages in the evolution, in the sense of the international system. And Afghanistan has in many ways really been at the heart of this, in what is in many respects a much broader debate. So in a sense, sort of, this all started at the height of the unipolar moment. I mean, this was, in retrospect, it really was, the beginning of the end of that moment, a moment that really began with the end of the Cold War. But, this real sense of Western values, being promoted, including through the use of hard power in different parts of the world. So this was the broader international context that we really operated in, which of course, not so much in the case of Afghanistan, but as we know in the case of Iraq, also led to what eventually became a rejection of all this. I mean, the sort of the fatigue of the forever wars. I mean, in many respects, Afghanistan was a victim of the excesses of that neoconservative outlook, which also led to sort of very deep transatlantic divergences, as we know, not in the case of Afghanistan, but certainly in the case of Iraq. And in a sense, Afghanistan gradually became a victim of a mood that started to change. So in a sense, if you kind of take, the first decade of the intervention, you can really see the way in which, from the height of that, from the pinnacle, you start moving towards, in a sense, a very different type of era, which is really one in which, which I would really place between, if you like, the global financial crisis to very recently, which is, in a sense, values being increasingly out of the international debate. So I think this started as I said, in many respects, a sort of healthy return of pragmatism, a sort of healthy pushback in many respects against the excesses of a neoconservative ideological outlook on the world. It then sort of trickled into pure transactionalism. But what is really striking is that if the withdrawal of Afghanistan had taken place, let's say 3 or 4 years ago, I asked myself the question, would this have led to the kind of, leading to the same result as we have seen, takeover of the Taliban, for the sake of argument? Would this have seen the same internal resistance, both in the United States and transatlantically? And I think the answer actually probably is no. If you had probably asked any European, most Europeans, not any European, but most Europeans, whether they thought that remaining in Afghanistan was a good idea 2, 3, 4 years ago, probably the majority would have told you that withdrawal was actually the thing to be done. So there was this general sense of pragmatism is back, maybe even transactionalism is back, and we really need to sort of refocus our attention. I think the struggle that we're facing now, and here I come to the third phase, is that although that healthy return in many respects of pragmatism is back, values are very much back in the international conversation. And they are so for reasons that don't have to do with Afghanistan, in all honesty. They have to do with the fact that the global confrontation is being increasingly recast as a confrontation that revolves around values, democracies versus autocracies, etc., right? And so, in a sense, the tragedy of Afghanistan, within Afghanistan, transatlantically, as well as within the US itself, has precisely got to do with the fact that we can't simply ignore values in the way in which we were tempted to do up until 2 or 3 years ago. But at the same time, we're aware that we can no longer promote them in the way which was the case in that first phase, in the sort of good old days of the liberal international order. And so we're stuck. And we don't quite know, and here I come to the future. Let me put it this way: to what extent, in order to promote our values in complicated places like Afghanistan post-withdrawal, to what extent we must quote unquote dirty our hands? And this gets us into the debates about what kind of aid conditionality, what are the conditions for recognition, to what extent should we be cooperating with difficult neighbors of Afghanistan? All of these things entail compromising on values, frankly speaking, if one wants to have an influence. But exactly where to draw that line is really where I think both internally in Europe and transatlantically, we still don't have good answers to that question.
Well, so Nathalie, as a direct follow-up to that, I'd like to ask you a question and then hear what Markus has to say to the same question. In light of the situation that you've just described, what leverage, if any, does the West have vis-a-vis the de facto government, vis-a-vis the Taliban?
Well, I think sort of in order to answer that question, we have to first be honest with ourselves and recognize that we don't have much. So in a sense, before we even think of the leverage, we need to think, and this is what was really behind my remark about quote unquote dirtying hands, to what extent are we willing and ready to lower the benchmark of what we're willing, what we want to achieve. By the way, this is not just an Afghanistan discussion. Let me give another example, which is Syria. In Syria, in a sense, because we were unwilling to lower that threshold, the truth of the matter is that we have had no influence at all. And it's, these are difficult trade-offs to make. You can always remain on your values high horse and, frankly speaking, do nothing and not engage at all. And this can, on a theoretical level, make you feel very good, but on a practical level, the effect that you will have is pretty much nil. So the question really is, what are the, given that the leverage is much lower, what is it, what are the quote unquote red lines that are achievable, but we will not be up to those great democratic standards that we had in mind when that leverage was substantially higher because it belonged to a different international context.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think you've made very important points, but I think also that given the humanitarian crisis that we're seeing unfolding, not engaging at all isn't an option either.
Exactly,
right?
But this is exactly my point. That there are values and values, and the kind of value of human life is the first amongst these. So there is, to an extent, a dirtying of hands, which is necessary.
Markus, what are your thoughts on the leverage that the West has? I mean, you're involved in talks at the moment, and I think your perspective would be really interesting for people to hear.
I agree with Nathalie. Don't lay the bar too high. I mean, we have values, but we also have interests. Our interests are peace and stability in Afghanistan. Prevent new influx of migrants to Europe. Of course, respect for human rights. We also have an interest that girls go to school, also to secondary school, that women go to work. We have an interest in a certain inclusivity. Otherwise, you won't have stability if you don't bring in. And I'm not talking about including Hamid Karzai or Dr. Abdullah into the government, but to include many social groups in Afghanistan, youth, women, ethnic minorities, what have you, into the society, not leaving them sort of marginalizing them. And counterterrorism is a huge issue for us as well. If we want to go back to Afghanistan, reopen our embassies, which by the way, Foreign Minister Muttaqi, acting Foreign Minister Muttaqi said, you can come back to Kabul, reopen the embassy. It doesn't necessarily mean recognition. So they themselves do a certain expectation management. But before coming back, I mean, security has to be there. It has improved, of course, but Taliban do not have Daesh under control at the moment. It's also an issue. So I think recognition is a leverage. Money. I mean, you've seen the Moscow formal conference. They were calling for the UN to convene another donors conference without inviting the UN, the EU, other Western countries. So it's the same that we've seen before by countries like China and Russia, asking the West to pay, but leaving them out when it comes to decision making. So it's a tricky decision to make. But of course, I mean, we have a responsibility, and we will support Afghanistan beyond humanitarian assistance. The UN is working on humanitarian assistance plus. Now, Taliban have requested us, for instance, paying salaries of civil servants. We say, okay, we can talk about that, maybe in the health sector, maybe in the educational sector, but that comes with conditions attached. I mean, for instance, we might pay teacher salaries if you agree, if you can guarantee that girls can go to secondary schools and the curricula remain unchanged. These are things we have to combine, but it's a very, very tricky issue and we have to find always the right balance.
Thank you, Markus. Erik actually just sent me a note that he has some thoughts on this leverage question as well. And so I'd like to bring Erik in, and then Summia, I'm going to come to you with some reflections and comments on what's been discussed so far.
Yeah, it's very, very interesting. Since 2006, there's been a global democratic recession. Every year, there are fewer democracies. And with that, there's been a rule of law recession. So it is interesting. We're globally, we're looking into our own soul to see what we actually have. The values that Nathalie talked about, they are back, but they're back with a sense of realism about what can actually be done. I think, Markus is dealing with the nitty gritty of where these conditionalities might hit the road. And I think that that's extremely important to sort through and to the extent possible, coordinate. And I say that mindful that the US did not do a very good job of coordination, particularly with Germany in the abrupt withdrawal. But we need to coordinate Western countries who are like-minded. Otherwise, the conditionality regime will not hold if we do not stand together. And I'm an optimist. I have to be, because I work in difficult countries. I've worked in difficult countries my entire career, but I'm not all that optimistic about being able to hold the line on conditionalities with fundamental issues of girls' and women's education and rights. I look to places like Venezuela. It's a regime that has just run wild, and we would have thought that Venezuela would be bankrupt and at the mercy of Western countries to install good governance. But Venezuela carries on. It's got the support of Russia. It's got the support of China. Likewise, Afghanistan has China's ready to do business. Russia may well do business. Pakistan has perpetually propped up the regime with funding from Saudi Arabia and the like. So it's a very complex global situation in which we find ourselves with Afghanistan and trying to exercise leverage for minimal demands that we think are reasonable.
Thank you, Erik. Summia, as you've listened to everybody speak over the last couple minutes, sort of what are the thoughts that have gone through your head, and from your perspective, because you have a pretty unique perspective on this panel, do you think that the West should engage with the Taliban or even negotiate with them?
Yeah, thank you. Well, yes, I think the answer is yes. We don't have a choice, unfortunately. They are the governing body now, and they do govern the country. And it is very important to engage and have conversations and dialogue, because otherwise we won't be able to actually help Afghans who are common Afghans who are just living their day-to-day lives, because very much so they're at the mercy of the government, Taliban. Although we don't want to recognize them, we don't want to give them legitimacy for what they've been doing, the atrocities and the human rights violations, the ban on girls' education. We don't have a choice, but we have to engage. But I think I just want to go back to the point of conditionality, because I want us to be a bit careful with the time frame of how long are we going to stretch this, because how long are we going to try to pressure the Taliban, and how long are we going to put conditions to release funds for various purposes, like salaries of teachers or salaries of civil servants? That's only going to hinder and affect more Afghans who just want to live their day-to-day life, and force them to leave the country or find other ways to find security, or they might join forces with the Taliban and actually become part of it. So I think, or they might join Daesh, so ISIS. So there are many factors that we need to think about. And I think the timing is very key. And my fear is that the longer we stretch this in order to pressure the Taliban, the more it's going to have extreme impact on Afghans who are in need of accessing basic resources. So it's a conversation of also like, how do we find that balance, or how do we find the middle ground of pressuring the Taliban to be able to let girls go back to school, to bring ethnic minorities back into public sphere, because right now all leaders are elected by one specific Pashtun ethnicity and are men. So how do we bring back all these people into public sphere, but also be able to provide the support for Afghans who are in need? Unfortunately, I don't have an answer for that. And that's something that I think we as the international community need to think about critically and take swift action and provide support where it's needed. So yeah.
So Summia, I mean, I think you've raised some very important points here, right? I mean, timing is essential. This is not something that can be postponed because there are a lot of lives that are at stake. I was somewhat heartened by a Wall Street Journal piece that I saw about the meetings this week, because the interim foreign minister said that, quote, changes are coming in the government. The big question to me is, what kind of changes, and will a new government be more inclusive and address some of the questions that you were raising? And I guess sort of I have a few questions for each of you as a panel. And one is, what can actually be done to improve the situation for people in Afghanistan? But then also, how can the international community really be most effective? Erik, you raised your hand. I don't know if you kind of want to take a stab at those two questions, or if you wanted to go in a different direction.
Well, I think we have to be very careful, because the interim foreign minister really doesn't speak for the Taliban on the ground. There's a great fracture within the Taliban between the Haqqanis and the Duranis, the gray beards who have been negotiating in Doha do not speak for the commanders, the Taliban commanders on the ground. So there is a great fracturing within the Taliban on ways forward. And I think the political side is well aware of the need for some concessions. The Doha group is aware of that. And I don't think that that is generally accepted by the Taliban on the ground in Afghanistan.
Any other thoughts, Nathalie or Markus, on what can actually be done by the international community to help improve the situation for people on the ground in Afghanistan? Nathalie, you turned your mic on.
Yeah, just very briefly to say, and this connects to a point that Markus was making concerning the way in which other neighboring countries are approaching it, and the way in which they are obviously excluding as well. But so I think that the way in which we should be thinking about this is also, how to turn this dynamic around, given that clearly we're talking about, particularly, obviously I have in mind here countries like Russia, like China, like Turkey, like Iran, that for their own reasons also have very deep concerns concerning the Taliban. So this doesn't necessarily have to be, and in fact, in the past was not something where sort of regional and global powers that actually took very different lines on pretty much anything were actually able to work when it came to Afghanistan. So there is a precedent about working together in a country like Afghanistan. And so, I think that the effort that we should be making is, in this particular case, superseding what is, and I was referring earlier to this kind of, ideological value divide, which is increasingly permeating the international system, given that when it comes to interests, to kind of, again, pick a word that Markus was mentioning, this is actually something where there is a precedent about working together. And I think we need to sort of find that spirit, in a sense, once again. I think in this respect, a sort of missed opportunity was the G20 sort of effort. I mean, maybe I'm being a bit Italian in this respect, but I think this was precisely the spirit that really drove Prime Minister Draghi And, you know, this is the kind of, you know, the G20, far more frankly speaking, the G7 was the kind of format to talk about Afghanistan. So I think, you know, we as Europeans, as Americans, really need to, again, sort of understand that this is unfortunately not an area where discussions amongst ourselves are really going to do the trick.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Nathalie. Markus, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, just a quick response to Nathalie, and it's a pity that regional countries couldn't come together with global donor countries. Now we've tried hard. I've tried for a year to have a group of 20, 25 countries and organizations, you know, and there is a lot of overlapping interest in that. The UK tried again in New York, you know, to bring together neighboring countries, China, also India, Russia, Iran, and plus major donors. It wasn't successful. So, and also, I mean, that is, I mean, we have seen the technical rollover of the UNAMA Security Council mandate. That has been postponed until March. March we will have, I mean, running up to March, we'll have a really harsh discussion on how to proceed with this UN mission. Taliban have to agree to that. For them, the UN are controlled by the US, and also China and Russia will try everything to get any references to human rights out of this mandate. So I really am worried about the future of this UNAMA mission. And then we are, well, stuck. We have still, of course, UN agencies there, but a coordination body is really missing.
Thank you. Nathalie, I know that you need to leave in a few minutes. And so I'd like to shift gears a little bit and ask you a question, because we've gotten a couple of comments in the chat and in the Q&A that focus on the transatlantic relationship and how this might play out in the transatlantic community. And one viewer is curious whether Europe is too dependent on the United States. But perhaps another way of sort of framing the question is what you think the impact of the US withdrawal from Afghanistan might have on the European debate about strategic autonomy and about distancing Europe from US leadership in foreign policy.
Now, I hate to kind of end on a negative note, but I'm afraid I'll have to. And, you know, I'm a big believer in strategic autonomy, because I actually think that this is exactly what we should be doing also, not only, but also to strengthen the transatlantic relationship. But if the question then is Afghanistan going to have an impact? Has Afghanistan had an impact on that? I think my answer would be very clearly no. Unfortunately, my sense is that whereas in the, I would say 2014 to 2018, more or less, period, there was a real drive behind European responsibility taking on security and defense matters for a number of different reasons, from Brexit to Trump to the world collapsing around us, much closer than Afghanistan, Syria, Libya, Ukraine, etc. And, you know, and in that period, a number of instruments and mechanisms were put in place. And it really did feel like there was a momentum behind this. Frankly speaking, beyond the chatter, and there's a lot of that, that momentum has been lost now. And I would love to say something different, but I just don't think that Afghanistan is changing the dynamic. You know, It's not the US withdrawal from Afghanistan, it's the US non-role in, you know, Ukraine and Syria and Libya, which touch much more direct chords, in a sense, in Europe. Now, that hasn't woken us up. I dare say that Afghanistan is not going to either. Which doesn't mean to say that there isn't a broader debate about European autonomy, but I think the sort of more fruitful dynamic under that, you know, underpinning that debate has more to do with industrial policy and tech and trade and the transatlantic dimension of that. But in the more traditional neck of the woods of security and defense, frankly speaking, I don't see much momentum at the moment.
So it's been interesting because several people have asked about the role of NATO in all of this, in sticking with that security dimension. One person is curious whether NATO should engage with the Taliban, and another person wants to know about the value of NATO on transatlantic collaboration writ large during the Afghan crisis, and whether NATO partners can rely on NATO or rely on the United States moving forward. I mean, I think those are some of the big questions that we're facing right now. Nathalie, you're nodding. Do you want to comment on that?
Just very briefly, and then I'll have to rush off. I think it is fundamentally mistaken to take the case of Afghanistan as proof of a lack of US commitment to European security. Mm-hmm. In fact, I think underpinning, and one can agree or disagree with it, but I think underpinning the Biden doctrine is actually precisely the opposite. It's basically saying, the US wants to refocus on what matters, and what matters are its allies and its adversaries. And so China and Europe are, in many respects, two sides of the same coin. Unfortunately, Afghanistan doesn't fit into that picture. But there is a certain coherence behind China and Europe in, I'm putting it in a very brutal way, Afghanistan out, that I think it would be mistaken to read the withdrawal from Afghanistan as a lack of commitment of the US to European security.
Thank you, Nathalie. And thank you for being with us today.
Apologies, I've got to leave you. It's been very interesting.
But thank you so much. To the rest of you, any thoughts on what we were just talking about with Nathalie about the role of NATO, but also this debate over strategic autonomy in Europe? And Erik, I saw you nodding your head a little bit, but Markus, as a German diplomat, I think it would be interesting to get your take on that as well.
Erik first, or should I?
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Okay. I wouldn't call it EU autonomy. Probably it's a more modest term is self-determination, or whatever you would call it. There have been attempts of that, but there's a lot of diversity within Europe as well. I mean, how does France define European autonomy? Maybe everybody should follow their ideas, and we feel the effect of the Afghanistan mission now in Mali, for instance. Delete US, put in France instead. And then you have, of course, the Eastern European countries, which very much rely on NATO rather than European autonomy, security autonomy. They're not very enthusiastic about that. Although I think that a greater European self-determination in terms of security could also help strengthen the transatlantic partnership. Definitely, Germany has not taken a leading role in that. We are still struggling with 2% target of spending 2% of our budget, yearly budget for defense expenses. We stand, I think, at 1.2, and we are in the middle of coalition. Obviously, just started coalition negotiations on a new government now being formed of 3 parties, among them the Green Party. So it will also that will remain an issue in Germany as well. And as long as we are sort of revolving around ourselves, we probably will not be able to play such a leading role in terms of security in Europe that we should play, actually.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Erik,
I think that talking about European autonomy is maybe, I wouldn't say ridiculous, but it is as far-fetched as talking about American autonomy. Because the problems that we face really require a collaboration. Mm-hmm. There are many voices, as Markus pointed out, in Europe. The EU has many different perspectives. I would agree with Nathalie that what happened in Afghanistan, it was really unfortunate that there wasn't collaboration and coordination on the withdrawal. collaboration coordination came far too late in the day. But I do not think, I mean, given the strength of NATO relationships and relationships transatlantic, I don't think that one incident is enough to completely reevaluate the fundamental nature of the relationship. We do have other things going on. You know, from the US perspective, China is the major threat. And so, you know, we do a deal with Australia on nuclear submarines. So there, you know, it's much more of a global dynamic than perhaps it has ever been. But I don't see the transatlantic relationship, because of Afghanistan, fundamentally changing.
Thank you. So we've got, you know, a few more minutes, and I'd like to invite our viewers to use the Q&A function to submit more questions if you have them. But I'd like to come back to the situation in Afghanistan and some of the work, Summia, that you've been doing with a question that one of our viewers has posed. One of our viewers writes, much of the discussion in the West has focused around evacuating the at-risk population, interpreters, journalists, etc. And this is no doubt the right thing to do. But where does this kind of brain drain leave Afghanistan? And what can we do to ensure that this new expat population can continue to positively influence the development of the country from abroad? Summia, I think that ties in, you know, very nicely with the work that you're trying to do as you're trying to get people out of Afghanistan. But what can be done to support them, and what can they do to support developments in Afghanistan?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and that's something that is a question that I've been thinking about myself. Unfortunately, brain drain is a major issue, but also cannot be stopped unless we provide security and basic resources and resources that are needed, and secure rights of women and minority groups who are currently marginalized in the current government system. So it's sort of inevitable to prevent brain drain from happening if circumstances remain the same way, because I'm not living in Afghanistan, so I would not want any of my family members to be living there. And I'm sure none of the audience here would want to have their family members in a circumstance like that. So yes, it is an issue, but at the same time, the conditions right now do not allow for people who are actually at high risk. Currently, it's a small group of people. Well, it's a small group of people who are extremely at high risk and need to leave as soon as possible. But the way things are unfolding, it might be the whole nation at some point where people might have to leave if things do not change. So brain drain is a problem, but at the same time, what we're doing with the network that I've been working on building is that how can people who have left the country work together on providing support for people who are left behind and change the current circumstances and provide them access to resources and other ways so that they can, so that we can prevent conditions from deteriorating, and also allow people to be able to live safer lives and find a way to keep their day-to-day life going within Afghanistan. Because the sad reality is that not everyone will be able to leave. And the brain drain debate comes up a lot, but if we actually look at the data of how many Afghans have left, there are not many who have left so far. We're a pretty locked country at this point. So, and I was traveling in Albania a few days ago, and it reminded me, like, learning about the history of Albania and what happened between the period that was locked. It very much reminded me of what's going on right now in Afghanistan. People are locked. Not everyone can leave. Very few specific people are leaving. And it's very important that we realize that and not let the images in media and the conversation about refugees sort of get us into this mistake of thinking that, oh, anyone can leave or everybody's leaving. Unfortunately, being able to leave is also a privilege that not many have. And many might have to live under the current circumstances and conditions. So yeah.
Thank you, Summia. Erik, I'd like to sort of ask you for your take on this, because obviously you have experience bringing students and faculty out of Afghanistan. You were talking a little bit about the difficulty in bringing them to the US. But how can these people that are leaving Afghanistan continue to have a positive influence from abroad?
Yeah, I think this is a really interesting set of issues. Numerically, Summia is right. There haven't been that many that have left. Those who have left are absolutely critical to the future of the country. They're some of the most skilled people who could help imagine a different future for the country. And here I would say that the rubber meets the road for the Taliban, because if they're acting in their interests, they will make the environment welcoming for women's education, for people who are trying to develop a better future for themselves. But that would require them to quell their enthusiasm for ideology. And so if they can get on board with their interests and see the longer term interests that they have in building a capable Afghanistan and sublimate some of their ideology, there might be a chance. Now, for those who are leaving, you know, I hope that the Afghan diaspora continues to contribute positively to things happening within Afghanistan. And my experience with Afghans is that they will do that if they're given opportunities to do it. But as far as the brain drain, we know this in movement of people around the world. Once you are capable and trained and educated, you will be seeking opportunities. And the idea of trying to bottle up these people like a genie in the bottle of Afghanistan simply won't work. So I think it's an incredibly challenging issue. And if the Taliban are really thinking about their own interests, they will be supportive of creating an environment where well-qualified people can live and flourish.
So that's very much a glass half full sort of view. And I guess the question that I have is, what's the likelihood that we'll see this sort of change in perspective among the Taliban? Summia, you raised your hand. I'm guessing you have a direct response to that.
No, I had raised my hand to respond to Erik's remark, but I completely agree with Erik in the sense that most of the people who have left and some of the refugees I met and talked to them, most of them want to return back. And a lot of them have left with the intention, including my father, with the intention that they will remain outside until the conditions get better, and some of them are willing to go back even if the Taliban's in power, as long as they have their rights secured, as long as they have the conditions to be able to live a good life and thrive, and are actually citizens who are able to do the things that they're doing right now abroad. And able to fully actually live their potential. So it's very important that we don't think of this as, so it is a brain drain temporarily, but if Taliban is able to create the conditions that allows Afghans to thrive, I would imagine people returning back, because a lot of people want to go back and rebuild the country and want to go back and live in Afghanistan.
Thank you, Summia. Markus, you turned your microphone on, so I'm sure that you have something to say to this. One of our viewers is curious whether you think we should just leave the country to the Taliban, or whether we should fight for this change in mindset.
Yeah, I turned the mic on purpose, and would like to agree with Erik when he said that the Taliban are not a monolithic bloc. Even within the Haqqanis, there are different positions, different opinions. And I talked to Anas Haqqani several times, and he's a representative of a younger generation, also generational problem within the Taliban. And Anas Haqqani with his sidekicks, Mohammed Jalal, for instance, Balkhi, Abdul Balkhi, they are very much advocating for girls' education, for women being students at universities. So there are different currents, different opinions. They have to be reconciled. And of course, ideology is not a good framework for that. I mean, I know what I'm talking about. I'm actually from East Germany, but used to be East Germany. And also that's my experience. I also explained to the Taliban when it comes to locking people up in a country. You know, the desire rises when you know that you can't leave the country. If Taliban are now issuing passports again, if at some point the airport will be open again and commercial flights, regular commercial flights will be resumed, then people might stay. More people might stay than would leave, because when you know that you can leave the country at any point without any problems, then okay, why should I do it today? I can also do it tomorrow. So there are a lot of ways to open, also to help Taliban. I think we should help them. We shouldn't leave them just alone. I had a little spat with my French colleague the other day who said, well, Taliban wanted to have power, now they have it, then let them have it, you know, and just stand by and watch. And that's not our approach, because as I said, we have responsibility. We cannot just leave the people of Afghanistan alone. We have to help them, and we have we have to help the Taliban stabilize the country.
So related to that, and I'd be interested in each of your views on this, particularly if there's some differences. One of our viewers just submitted a question saying, will it be possible for people who are part of the Afghan diaspora to actively build up Afghanistan without fear of retribution in the future? And I think that's sort of one of the questions. And Summia, you talked about this a little bit earlier, that part of the reason why your father was in the sights of the Taliban was because of your activism earlier. This fear of retribution, I think, is one that many people must have. Is that something that might be waning at the moment, or is that something that is still very strong and front of mind?
Yeah, I think the fear of retribution is also one of the key reasons why people who are within the country are not speaking up. There's media censorship as well, but now people feel very much scared to be able to express their opinions freely or identify themselves. And even people who have left the country, if they have relatives back home, they don't want to be on media. They do not want to be identified. They don't want their pictures to be taken, because they are very much scared that that could lead to retributions towards their families. So it is a very imminent fear. Would that hinder Afghan diaspora from coming together and working for the cause? I don't think so. I think there are many of us who are privileged in positions where our families are in safe places and who are abroad. And at the moment, I'm one of the fortunate ones that my family is outside, so I can speak. And I know that there might be retributions in the future for myself, but at least I'm not putting my family at risk or in the country. So it really depends where each Afghans are, where are the Afghans located and where their families are. So it depends on the situation, but I don't think it can necessarily hinder the whole diaspora from coming together and being able to work on the cause. Yeah.
Let me take just one example, and that is, you know, if starvation does take hold in Afghanistan, you can be sure that the Afghan diaspora will contribute generously to the humanitarian, to easing the humanitarian crisis. And I have many Afghan friends who are contributing on a welfare basis to the country. So I don't see that going away. But to really reach the scale that is needed, again, the Taliban have to see what's in their interests and leave some of their ideology behind, because it's a retributive ideology without a doubt. And friends of mine are under threat and beaten, and all of that has to change if the Taliban want to achieve what it wants. But then again, you have the Doha split from the Taliban in the field, who have been fighting for years and know nothing but fighting. So it's a tricky situation.
So we are rapidly coming to an end here, and I want to thank all three of you for an incredibly thoughtful and thought-provoking conversation, and also Nathalie as well. And as a closing question, I want to maybe piggyback on a piece that Erik wrote last month in American Purpose, where he outlined 7 myths about Afghanistan. And so I'm going to come to Erik last, but I'd like each of you to maybe mention just 1 or 2 things that you think people should take away from this conversation about Afghanistan. What are the 1 or 2 key points in a nutshell? And maybe Summia, will start with you, and then Markus and Erik.
I think the most important, my fear is that people will stop talking about Afghanistan and slowly forget. And that is something I do not want happening, because in order for the changes to come into place, we need to keep talking about Afghanistan. And maybe Afghanistan is no longer a strategic interest for a lot of the countries, as we discussed today. But I just want to warn us that what happened, the reason why 9/11 happened was that after the Cold War, when Afghanistan was no longer a strategic interest for the US or Russia and was left on its own, and there was a vacuum that was created, and which led eventually to a battle of power between different factions of groups and the Taliban coming into power, and then 9/11 happened. I fear that something like that could happen eventually again, if we don't actually stabilize Afghanistan and pay attention to Afghanistan. So it might not be currently a strategic interest anymore, but that doesn't mean it cannot be in the future. It can because right now we don't have only the Taliban, but we also have the ISIS taking power within Afghanistan. And that could lead to several other potential risks for the region itself. So it's very important that we continue these conversations and continue conversations about Afghans who are going through, Afghans who are currently in Afghanistan, and the difficulties they're facing that we talked about and that I mentioned about the families. I think it's very important that we speak about them, because there are people whose rights are marginalized, people who are at risk of starvation, who are at risk of being persecuted. There are just so many different factors that needs to be considered. And I hope that people hear from this panel when they leave and go, that they continue discussions about Afghanistan, continue keep creating awareness about Afghanistan and the importance of providing support that's needed for Afghans who are currently going through so many difficulties.
Thank you, Summia. Markus, one takeaway that people should take with them about Afghanistan.
I have nothing much to add to what Summia said. The Afghan people is worth being supported, and that doesn't mean we should support any violent uprising, opposition, whatever is forming now. I think the West has enough intervening or meddling into these skirmishes. So while Taliban are there, let's be realistic, they have won. There's no serious political alternative at the moment. So support the people, and for that also we have to interact with Taliban, and let's maintain, let's preserve as many achievements as possible, and we as the West should leverage our influence on them.
Thank you, Markus. And Erik, last but not least.
Yeah, just finally, I want to underscore what Summia said about don't forget Afghanistan. And it's both for humanitarian reasons and for our values, but it is also strategic interests. It is in our interests. I'm very worried about the stability of the region. One of the conditions in the Trump agreement was to make sure that the Taliban would control international terrorism. The Taliban profoundly do not have the capacity to control that threat of international terrorism coming from the shores of, not the shores, it's a landlocked country, but from Afghanistan. I also want to dispel this idea. There's discourse in Washington that, oh, Afghanistan's a failed state. Let's forget it. People forget about, that implies a lot of judgments about humanity and about humanitarian assistance and about how the citizens of Afghanistan, never mind the state, deserve our attention. I also think that state building is possible. That's another issue in Washington. Oh, it's, state building is a failed project. If state building is done well, and we didn't do it very well in Afghanistan for a variety of reasons, we can still do state building on a scale if we can be thoughtful about it. So don't forget Afghanistan. State building is possible. Stability in the region is key, and there's a lot to worry about. But I'm reminded of an Indian philosopher, Ashish Nandi, who once said, "Our inability to imagine alternatives is the surest guarantee of oppression." So we've got to keep imagining.
Well, thank you all. This has been a fabulous discussion, and I'd now like to give the floor to our hosts, the Harvard Conference.
I would like to thank Ambassador Markus Potzel, Professor Nathalie Tocci, Professor Erik Jensen, Summia Tora, and of course you, Dr. Steven Sokol, for this excellent and lively discussion. Thank you for sharing your views on this. As we have seen, this is a multidimensional topic with many possible approaches and potential solutions. We have also learned that the dynamics of such a multifaceted issue can create unforeseen additional complexity, even rendering well-targeted policies ineffective. Especially in times of short-lived news cycles and quickly changing attention spans, it is of utmost importance not to forget that articles and news videos only reflect short episodes of people's everyday lives. I hope the future will show that our governments and policies can improve the situation there and that we can help the people of Afghanistan better. For those of you who would like to learn more about this topic, I would like to draw your attention to the German-American Conference podcast we produced on the topic of transatlantic relationships in action, how Germany and the US worked together during the Afghanistan crises with Anne McElvoy, Dr. Claudia Mayor, and Dr. Magdalena Kirchner. We would also like to welcome you to watch the next panel on sports, and if this is the next LGBTQIA+ battleground. Stay tuned. Thank you very much for your attention, and have a nice one.